Step one of performing the Sumo RDL is to grab your kettlebells, dumbbells, or barbell and assume a traditional sumo setup. So you can take it out from the rack or you can lift those from the ground, and you're gonna wanna get into a stance that is very similar to what you would use when you were pulling sumo. Now, what I will say is if you are super wide traditionally sumo and really maxing out the space of the plates and the width of the barbell, you might wanna bring your feet in just a little bit to make this a little bit more feasible, to get a bit more out of that RDL stretch with the posterior with it. Step two is you're going to begin thinking about hinging back. So think as though a string is pulling your hips directly back. If I was behind you, for example, coaching you, and I was pulling your hips back with a string, that's the translation we want. So we want those hips to track back, back, back. We're gonna assume a soft knee bend. So let those knees slightly bend based on your anatomy. Everybody will look slightly differently. If you wanna keep your hips higher, you totally can, if that's where you feel the most stretch, or you could bend a little bit more if you feel a lot of stretch there. You're gonna think about pulling those hips back and letting that bar sink around where that midfoot is. Now, when it comes to that tracking of the bar, don't be afraid to play with different positions here. Because you're in a sumo stance, that is gonna vary a lot from lifter to lifter. And so if you feel more stretch on the glutes and the hamstrings and the adductors as you do these, with the bar being a little bit further out from you versus over traditionally that midfoot position, that's okay. Play around with different positions. Step three, once you have those hips translating back and you feel that maximal stretch and you're at that end range of motion, you're then gonna think about bringing that bar up in the same path you brought it from, and you're gonna think as if I'm in front of you now, pulling your hips forward. So I'm pulling those hips directly forward to that bar. So you're gonna think squeeze the hamstrings, glutes, and then as you stand up and your hips come into that barbell, think about squeezing your glutes at the top. That nice squeeze at the top and that nice squeeze through the legs, so when your legs are pretty much at their fully locked out position again, that is what's going to signal you to start your next rep. Once you have locked out, you're then going to repeat step two and let those hips translate back, and then repeat step three, bring those hips forward and squeeze those glutes and hamstrings and bring those hips to the bar. Now, when it comes to your torso positioning and your head positioning, let's talk about that because that will be important through step 2 and 3. With your gaze, generally speaking, it's gonna vary a lot. And you might find that with different weights, you gaze a little bit differently based off of what's most comfortable. For example, if I'm training a little bit lighter with higher reps, I'll sometimes keep a slightly more extended position with my gaze. It just helps me, I think, focus on what my hips are doing. If I'm getting heavier, it feels a little bit more uncomfortable to do that because that weight is pulling down as I'm trying to look up. So I will assume a slightly more stacked gaze with my head position. So think more neutral with my torso. As you move through reps and different weights, feel out different positions and feel what's best. What I would say is start with your gaze about 10 to 12 feet out in front of you and just let that track accordingly. That'll have you at this like slightly extended position throughout, and that will likely feel most comfortable for most lifters, but don't be afraid to play with different positions. As your demands and as your reps and weight, etc., increase and ebb and flow, it is totally normal to assume different positions a little bit as you move through reps. Plus, as effort increases and as fatigue sets in, you'll notice that your form starts to change a little bit. Don't get so rigid with your thinking that you box yourself into not thinking a rep is good just because you didn't move like a robot. Let your body do its thing and assume different positions based off of what feels best. And remember, the main goal at hand here is feeling a nice stretch in the hamstrings, glutes, adductors, and that whole posterior chain when you're doing your Sumo RDLs. All right, so now why perform the Sumo RDL? Number one, I think it's a great variation to just get you out of that traditional RDL stance. I think it'd be really powerful to change your stance in a lot of different exercises, and the RDL is no different. So taking that wider stance, it will change how your hips track and where you feel it in your hamstrings and glutes, and that could be a great thing for giving you a different variation to have a different stimulus when you're trying to hit the posterior chain and those muscles. The second reason why you might want to perform Sumo RDLs is if you find that your Sumo deadlift is lagging or your lockout is a little bit weak, you might want to perform Sumo RDLs because that's going to focus on that like mid to upper range of motion. So that range of motion where the hips extending is incredibly important. So if your Sumo deadlift is lagging, try Sumo RDLs for a block, take out your Sumo deadlifts and see how that translates to your performance. The third reason why you might want to perform them is if you're working around a knee injury and doing any form of RDL feels a little bit weird on the knee or feels a little bit unstable, widening that stance can be a nice way to allow you to still get an RDL stimulus and work around some knee discomfort. So I've used them, for example, in my program when I've been working around quad tendon stuff, because sometimes traditional RDLs can make my knee feel a little bit weird or unstable. So a Sumo RDL can be a great swap to get that stimulus while still training and progressing in the gym. So two things to avoid or kind of think about with Sumo RDLs is number one, when you are getting into your position and you are going through your eccentric, so you're lowering that bar down, Pay close attention to what your knees are doing. Your knees are going to have flexion, and every lifter will have various degrees of flexion. But if you're flexing too much, you might actually be taking away some of that work from the hamstrings, adductors, glutes, etc., and all the muscles on the backside of the body. So if you feel like that might be you, film your set from the side, and then try doing a higher hip position with less knee flexion to see if you feel a little bit more. If you find that you're squatting that weight too much, you'll be taking away that work. So just something to think about is any form of really deep knee flexion that might actually hinder some of the gains you're trying to bias and get for the posterior muscles. The second thing to think about is when you are in your setup and your stance, pay attention to where you're displacing weight in the feet. A lot of times with sumo deadlift, we like to think about spreading that floor, so pushing in to the lateral sides of the feet, and that can be fantastic. However, I would challenge you to where, as you're doing your sumo RDL reps, think about also feeling that midfoot and feeling that tripod foot position and see what type of pressure in the feet allow you to feel your sumo RDLs even better. Sometimes I notice, for example, is if I'm going too lateral with my feet and putting too much pressure in the outsides of my feet, I'm actually losing out on getting a little bit more adductor, some VMO, and that internal hamstring muscle. So play around with different foot positions and don't be afraid to try out different things as you do different sets throughout your block or throughout your accessories as you have your Sumo RDLs program. If you've never performed Sumo RDLs, give them a try. Try doing them for a full block and report back on how they feel. Don't be afraid to play with different stances and different positions when you're doing these and different implements. Try a barbell, try a kettlebell, try a dumbbell. Just add more things to your toolbox for training RDLs and the posterior muscles. It can be an awesome tool. But if you have additional questions on this exercise, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.